Greetings from Gloucester. My name's Phil, and I work with the British Sign Language Bible Translation Project as a biblical scholar. And I wanted to share with you today some of the translation issues we faced and how I've gone about trying to help the team with those issues. We're at the moment working on the book of Genesis, and we began by looking at Genesis chapter 22, where God decides to test Abraham and asks him to take Isaac to be sacrificed. And we came across an issue with the use of names in this chapter, and that's what I want to share a little bit about. I'm going to share my screen here so you can see some of the things we were working on and the process we went through as a team to work through these issues. So what I'm showing you right here is a program called Paratext that's freely available to anyone who's involved in Bible translation. I'll put the links in the description below if you want to get hold of it. You can see here I've got a whole variety of different English translations on the left-hand side here and what's called a text collection. And I've got in focus here the Net Bible, which I always find useful because down below it has some good notes that come from the Net Bible explaining translation issues. And on the right side over here, I've got it set up with the Hebrew text to help me see what's actually happening in the original. The issue I wanted to talk about particularly today was this issue that we came up in verse 1. It starts in verse 1. You'll see here in the net, it is sometime after these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am." Abraham replied. Okay, looks fairly straightforward in English, and you'll see most of the English translations here have the name used, Abraham, and you can see it in the Hebrew. Vayomer elav Avraham, he said to him. Abraham, Vayomer hineni, he said, here I am. Now the question is, what to do about this word, Avraham here, or the name Abraham. When we're working on this with the British Sign Language Project, the translators were very clear to me that it's not natural in sign language to address somebody by name. You don't do it. Somebody will be looking at you and you're signing at them. You don't need to tell them what their name is. You certainly don't finger spell it. You wouldn't even use the sign name. My sign name is King like this, but if you're addressing me, you wouldn't say King, though you might talk about me that way when you're talking to somebody else. The team had already also been working on translation of Mark for a while, and it's already been a team decision that they weren't going to translate names like this in Mark, like when Jesus says something to Peter and he addresses him Peter. They don't use the name there. There's also the team philosophy for the project, which says that they're going to go for the closest natural equivalent. Now, if it's not natural in sign language, in British Sign Language, to use a name when you're calling out to someone, then it looks odd if you put it into the Bible text here. So we need to think whether this is going to be a useful thing to do or not, whether we want to use, whether it's so important in the biblical text that the name is used that we want to make sure we use the name Abraham here when God calls out to him, or whether we want to follow the natural patterns of sign language, especially British Sign Language, and not use the name. So trying to think about those things, one of the things I did was be able to look at some of the options in other sign languages. I'm just going to try to call up a different window here. Here we've got a program called SLTT, Sign Language Translation Tool, which enables me to look at translations into other sign languages. So here we've got the American Sign Language version, which I can look at how they translated Genesis chapter 2. Here, this one, I think. Let's play this at the beginning. See it sometime later, and God looked at Abraham there. He's going to test him. I presume. I don't speak it, American Sign Language, but I can follow some of it. And this is the point where God's going to address him. So you'll see there that God just tapped Abraham on the shoulder, and then Abraham turned and looked at him. God didn't use his name there. We could compare this with Australian Sign Language, for example, see what they did there.
God sends Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He called to him, Abraham.
So we see just there, when God called to him in Australian Sign Language, God actually finger spelled his name when he was calling to him. So that's a different solution to the Americans. And then I looked at some other ones as well. So like we could look down here, we've got a Nigerian Sign Language example. Let me see if I can find the right one here. That's the introduction to the story, the heading for the story. Look at Abraham. So there again, it looks like God tapped him on his shoulder to get his attention, and then he used his name sign, the held back wrist, when he was speaking. So it looks like in both Nigerian and Australian, they've used some way of using the name when God tries to get Abraham's attention. In Nigerian, they've used the name sign. Australian, they've used the finger spelling, whereas in the American, they just did the tap on the shoulder to get his attention. So the question was, well, what are we going to do in British Sign Language with this passage? Now, it's interesting, as we looked at this, let me get Paratext back open again. Right, so this is something that's quite important in several places in Genesis 22. So we have it here. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. If we also look at verse 11, here you are. This is the point at which Abraham is ready to sacrifice Isaac, but the Lord's angel called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, and here I am, he answered. And again, we can look across into the Hebrew here and see Avraham, Avraham. So Vayoma Hineni, and he said, here I am. So this second time, we have again God talking to Abraham, or rather the Lord's angel at this point. And again, Abraham replying, here I am. This is just one of several repetitions throughout this passage where it's perhaps deliberately repeating the same sort of phraseology from earlier. And maybe there's some point to it. When it is here, it's Abraham, Abraham. It's repeated twice. So is there a difference? Why did, in verse 1, why did he just say Abraham? And in this verse, he says Abraham, Abraham. And if we're going to decide in BSL that we're not going to use the name sign at all, do we need to translate this differently in some way to what we had earlier? There's actually something also similar in this passage discovered in verse 7. We have Isaac and Abraham walking along together. And at this point, Isaac says to his father, my father. And he replies, what is it, my son? Again, in British Sign Language, and maybe more widely in sign languages, you don't typically say something like, you don't say something like that when you're talking to somebody. A team told me the only time you'd use something like father when addressing someone is when you're praying and talking to God, and then you would sign Father God. But in normal conversation, you wouldn't talk to your dad by addressing him as father. You just tap on his shoulder or get his attention some other way in order to talk to him. So again, there's a question, are we going to translate these words literally into sign language in a way that would be making it very unnatural conversation for British Sign Language? But in order to make it more word for word corresponding to what was in the original Hebrew. Again, you can see that this is in the Hebrew. If I click here into verse 7, Vayomer Yitzchak el Abraham Aviv. Vayomer, so Isaac said to Abraham, his father, and he said, Avi, my father. Vayomer Hineni beni, here I am, my son, something like that. So all these examples, whether it's Abraham, or my father, or my son, technically in linguistics, these are called vocatives. The little phrases or words that we're using to address the person we're talking to, saying who they are, to get their attention before we start saying something else, the main content of what we want to say to them. And the point is that in BSL, just generally doesn't use these vocatives at all and not a natural part of communication. So the real question is, if we're trying to do a closest natural equivalent, then the question is, what is the function of these vocatives and how would we represent that function in British Sign Language? That's a very different language, different way of structuring how discourse works. And how would we go about doing that? So I'll just show you some of the things that I would think about when looking at this kind of problem. So I've already mentioned that here I'm using paratext. One of the great things about paratext, as well as having lots of different English translations I can look at, it also includes access to the UBS handbook, which is a handbook for translators. Got that here. It says HBKENG, the English handbook from United Bible Societies, which gives translation tips and advice, and also the SIL translators notes. They're called TNN as a resource in paratext. Both of these are good places to go to look for advice. So I started looking through these to see what it advises here. So here we have the handbook and what it says about it. And it says, Abraham is here a form of address that often requires adjustments. And I guess that's what we're talking about here, such as you, Abraham. Many languages in Papua New Guinea can use a form that calls a person from some distance away and say, Abraham, oh, and I used to work in Papua New Guinea. I can understand that. Doesn't really help with BSL though. It notes here that the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation, the Vulgate, the Latin translation, as well as some modern translations say Abraham, Abraham. But the Hebrew text has the single Abraham. So our project, we've decided we're primarily working from the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. So we would be going from the original of Abraham. It notes here that the Hebrew Old Testament text project rates this as the single Abraham as the one recommended for translators. And it says, nevertheless, if a language requires a repeating of the name in calling out to a person, that form should be used. If it's optional, the single use of the name should be used. It doesn't tell us what to do if your language wouldn't use a name at all in addressing people, as we have in sign language. How about the translator's notes? Let's see if they offer us something interesting. Again, it's quite a long way through this verse because there's lots of discussion about what it means to test Abraham. But that's not what we want to focus on right now. He called to him, Abraham. Abraham, God called to Abraham, and Abraham immediately answered. The author used this short call and response to indicate that something important was about to happen. Okay, so maybe there's a clue to the function here. It's indicating something was important was to happen. At least that's what the SAL notes authors think. He notes the author used this kind of call and response again in 22:7. That was the example we mentioned with my father and my son between Isaac and Abraham. And in 22:11, that's where the angel calls out to stop him from sacrificing Isaac. So this thing is repeated 3 times, this use of a vocative to call out to someone, and the reply, here I am, emphasizing important parts of the account. It notes here at the climax of the account, the angel called out Abraham's name 2 times. So it is making me think, we need to make a difference perhaps between what we do in verse 1, where he calls out once, and here where he calls out the name twice. That's some ideas from the translator's handbook and the translator's notes. They don't always give me a deep understanding of the text and of the Hebrew text. So I do generally want to check and look in a commentary as well. So I'm just going to go across to access some commentaries I have. This is a piece of software called the Logos Bible software. It's available to Bible translators for just $65 at the moment. And if you're involved in a Bible translation project, you can get something called SIL Translators Workplace. I'll put the links in the description. And that gives you access to a variety of different commentaries. Like here, I've got the New International Commentary on the Old Testament and the Word Biblical Commentary. These are both really good commentaries on the biblical text that might give me some more advice. So I'm going to look at what it says in the Word Biblical Commentary and the New International Commentary of the Old Testament on these vocatives. Let's just have a quick look at verse 1 first of all, and see if the Word Biblical Commentary says anything here about the use of the name Abraham. So it's noticed it matches scene 6 with echoes of Genesis 12:1 with Abraham, here I am. Is it saying anything else about using the name? It mentions again 3 times in this story we have the refrain Abraham or my father, with its response here I am, each one signaling a tense new development in the narrative. Let's then have a look at verse 7 and see if it tells us anything, suggests anything there. It notes how this scene of the dialogue is framed by the 2 of them going on together, suggesting their isolation and their companionship as they climb up the mountainside. It notes here, in the dialogue, the repeated my father and my son draws attention to the deep affection binding father and son. The dialogue itself is ambiguous and open to more than one interpretation. So they're saying that there is a function here of these vocatives to try and show that there is affection between Abraham and Isaac. So that's something we want to try and make sure is communicated in the BSL, even if we're not using the words my father and my son. We're going to agree with this interpretation here. And maybe let's just see if there's any notes on verse 11 that are useful to look at. So here we've got the reference to Abraham, Abraham. Compared with the single Abraham of verse 1, the urgent double call shows the angel's anxiety that he could be too late. So again, maybe the function here is to really get Abraham's attention quickly. Maybe that's why God uses the name twice. So we want to make sure we show that in the translation into BSL. So it's something about getting attention. We need to make sure there's more urgency, perhaps, in verse 11, and the vocatives in verse 7. Looks like we need to show that there is an intimate relationship, affection between Isaac and Abraham. I'm going to go back to SLTT and show you what we've come up with as a team. Let's look at the very beginning here and see. Sometime later, Abraham, there's God, he wanted to look at him, he wanted to test him, see what he'd do. So he tapped him, and Abraham said, here I am. So there we haven't got the name there. We've just chosen a normal tap on the shoulder to get his attention, which would be mirroring the function of that calling out of Abraham in the first place. Let's see if I can find around verse 7 where we have Abraham and Isaac walking together. Oh, that's too early. Maybe about here. So he's talking about how we're going to go over to that place and worship, and then we're going to come back again. That's about verse 5. They took the wood, put it on Isaac's shoulder, took the fire. That's a whole other translation issue there. And the knife. And the two of them walked on together. And Isaac's carrying the wood. He's wondering, no, he's tapping his father. His father says, here I am. So the question is there, did we manage to capture something of the affection between them? Did we get the idea that they are in a good relationship? I think it's pretty well captured there. Then let's look at the point at which Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac, putting his son on the altar. There he's drawing his knife, and the messenger of the Lord pulls out and said, stop. So that's where in the original it would say, Abraham, Abraham. We see here a fairly dramatic, urgent plea there to stop what he's doing, and Abraham looking again. So we've got in each of these 3 times, we have Abraham looking back, mimicking the here I am that's in the original text. So I think that's looking pretty good. So for me and the BSL project, the next step would be to send this to reviewers, focus groups of BSL users to see what they think of the text. And we also send it to a couple of other biblical scholars, get their opinion, see if they think it's okay. And then we put those into SLTT so that we can see them and look at them. I'm just looking at one of the reviewers from the comments, one of the comments from reviewers here. He's noticed this thing here. The Hebrew text says, has God saying Abraham's name twice? Many sign languages do not use vocatives, so he's recognized that like we do. And here the vocative is replaced by a shoulder tap. This is fine. So that's good to have some support from somebody else from outside looking independently at this project. So it's not just based on me. In other areas, that might be from somebody who's an official consultant associated with the project. It's always good to get other people's feedback and checking whether the advice that I've given is good advice or not, whether they agree with it. We also have some feedback from the focus groups, but they didn't comment on this issue. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So, I mean, I think in terms of our project in this particular passage, we went through a pretty good process there, and we've come up with something that the team's happy with, that the other biblical scholars are happy with who've looked at it. But I have to say, it got me thinking, like, what is the difference in the Bible between the times when God says one time somebody's name? Why does he sometimes not use a name at all? Why does he use Abraham or somebody else's name sometimes? Why does he sometimes use the name twice? Started looking at myself as well. So I've did a Google search. How many times does God call out to someone twice by name? If you Google that, you'll find out there's some people say 7 times, sometimes 8, sometimes 9, sometimes 10, depending how exactly you count the different times and different occurrences. Certainly, God calls out Jacob, when Jacob's getting ready to go down to Egypt. Calls out Samuel, the 3rd time that he's calling Samuel when he's a young lad in the temple. He calls out Moses from the burning bush. So if you look at all of these and try and explore, is there something significant here? And one of the websites I looked at, I know said this might be particularly urgent information, really trying to get someone's attention. If that makes sense. thinking of looking into it a bit more deeply, the question of why do you sometimes use a name and other times not use a name? Is it just about getting attention, or is there something else communicated by that? Something I'd like to look into a little bit more. So one thing I did do was try and reach out to some friends. I'll just share my screen again briefly. I'm part of something called the BT list, the Bible translation list. That's a group where you can connect with other people involved in Bible translation around the world, and all sorts of great people willing to help. And it's anyone can subscribe to that list. I'm going to put the link into the description. So I just asked the question out on that list, just wondering if anyone has a list of vocatives in the Old Testament, like examples in narrative where someone is addressed by the name at the start of the direct speech, but also times when relational vocatives are used, like my father and my son. You can see where I was coming from in asking this. Or can you point to any resource that talks about this? Maybe someone has an idea that I don't know about. I'm interested in exploring why names are used sometimes and not others. And what's amazing was, like, somebody wrote back to me immediately, I should be able to pull up a list pretty quickly. And then within a matter of hours, somebody had sent to me this wonderful list here, which I'll see if I can show you this. All the times that these kind of vocatives are used in the Bible. I mean, isn't this fantastic? It's so amazing to be part of a group of people with the same desire to explore these kind of issues, with the skills to get into it. And you can just reach out and ask people to help you. So I've got this fantastic list right now, and he's put all the examples in here in Hebrew and in English that I can look through, and I could try and find out exactly, why these vocatives used in these different circumstances. You can see a lot of them are in Genesis. They're using titles like Lords or talking to God as Lord, but also you see Hagar called by name, Abraham called by name several times, Ada and Zillah called by name by Lamech. So it would take a little bit of exploring, and I haven't had the time yet to explore it in as much detail as I'd like, but I hope to get the time to do that. Another interesting thought that came out of that conversation when talking to others, somebody wrote back to me and said, well, I'm not really sure about the fact that you've taken Abraham out there. Aren't the BSL users, aren't they aware that Abraham was a hearing person? So it'd be natural if you had two hearing people talking to each other to use their names. So why not keep in Abraham, and they can work out, well, they're using the name Abraham because that's what hearing people do when they're talking to each other. I'm still thinking about that. Something to bring up with the team, but we need to go with the priority for the decisions that have been made about the translation project, for this particular project, that we are going for the closest natural equivalent. And we're looking for natural BSL discourse stretches. So reflecting on this particular passage and my experience, I just think, what are the kind of values that came through from that experience I had? When I think the importance of listening to the team, it was really helpful for me to have the team tell me clearly, this is not how we naturally talk in BSL. I'm not a great BSL communicator myself. It wouldn't have occurred to me, and it could be very easy for me as a Hebrew scholar to be saying, well, look, this is what it says. It says Abraham, and then it says Abraham, Abraham. So we need to get those words in there, especially that my father, my son. We need to get that into the text because that's what the Hebrew says. But I think it's very important, even though I have that Hebrew background, to be listening to the team and listening to what is actually natural in BSL if we want this to communicate well. Another thing that struck me is the importance of giving advice in line with what they've decided as a project. And no good me saying you need to do what the Hebrew says when they've decided that the philosophy of the project or the approach of the project is to work towards natural translation, something that looks natural in BSL, and this would look very unnatural to them. The third thing that thinking back on the values is the availability of resources, different things to look at, and making the best use of all the different resources. So we have translators' notes. I have lots of different English translations. I have all the different sign language translations that are there freely available. And also there's resources of other people who I can talk to, like through the BT list. It's just great to be part of a broader community and to remember to use those resources to help while I'm trying to provide support to the team that I'm working with. And finally, I think the value of continuing to learn, just for me, this process of translation has opened a great new question about, well, why are names used or not used? And I'm looking forward to trying to explore that further. And if I find something out, trying to share that with other people too.